and we are very fortunate. We have Peadar Kirby to talk to us, and this seminar is part of a series called Europe Dialogues, hosted by the Institute of International Affairs. Peadar is here for the fifth or sixth time. He has been writing articles together with Baldur Þórhallsson. He is retired or semi-retired from the University of Limerick in Ireland, and he is going to talk to us about the Eurozone small states in crisis, lessons from Ireland. There is just one thing I would add from myself here, and that is the definition of crisis. I'm recently back from Athens in Greece, and I was speaking to a man I got to know there, and he was asking about the environment in Iceland, how we were coping with the crisis. And we compared growth figures and unemployment figures, and this guy said to me, "You don't know what crisis is." Well, in Ireland they know a bit better, so we are very eager to hear what you have to tell us. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. So, what I've been asked to speak about is small states in crisis. We're well aware that a number of European states are in crisis, states in the Eurozone. It's interesting that all the states that are in bailout programs, program countries, are indeed small states. Spain and Italy have avoided that so far, largely I think because it simply would probably collapse the whole show if bailout packages had to be designed for them. So we've had in that order Greece, Ireland, Portugal, now Cyprus of course, and there are rumours that I see being mentioned again and again of Slovenia being denied inevitably. Outside the Eurozone, you're the only country that has had this financial crisis. And of all these countries, really only Iceland is the one that one can say is in recovery if you look at evidence of figures like GDP growth and declining unemployment. Ireland, however, among the Eurozone programme countries is regarded as being the model reformer. And so that's what I'm going to focus in on, the Irish case and the lessons we can learn from it for the whole Eurozone crisis and the future of the Eurozone itself indeed. I want to look at, first of all, the Eurozone diagnosis of the problem. I want to look at the prescriptions for dealing with it and their impacts, and then to analyse whether, judging from the Irish case, these prescriptions are indeed curing the problem or making it worse. Now, the Eurozone diagnosis is a pretty straightforward one. It is to do with debts that our countries were irresponsible in running up large debts, and the way to get out of those is to impose austerity in order to lead them back towards balanced budgets and manageable debts as a GDP, as a percentage of GDP. That's 60% is, of course, the figure that was applied from the time of the Maastricht Treaty onwards. It's widely seen that Germany is the main country that's promoting this understanding of the problem. Certainly in the Irish case, I don't know about other cases, there's been a lot of criticism of the German position, including, for example, by our former Prime Minister John Bruton, who wrote to the President of the Commission, Barroso, arguing with him that indeed German banks and other banks throughout the Eurozone had benefited from the Irish crisis, and being very critical of the fact that they weren't willing to shoulder any of the burden of adjustment, which has, of course, been cast entirely on the Irish state and the Irish taxpayer. Now, an alternative view to this diagnosis of the problem is that if you look at countries, particularly the cases of Ireland and Spain are mentioned, that we had low debt GDP ratios in the run-up to the crisis. So in that view, it's not a problem of indebtedness, it's a financial problem. It's a problem of a banking sector that wasn't adequately regulated, that grew very greedy and ran away with itself, but that the costs of adjusting to the cost of bailing out that banking sector have been imposed upon the public purse, and that's at the core of the problem. Now, if that's the diagnosis, the prescription is austerity. It's a mixture of cutting spending and increasing taxes. In the Irish case, the state has, since the bailout package of November 2010, decided that it's going to meet its targets, 2/3 of them through cutting spending and 1/3 through raising taxes. This adjustment has already taken 6 years, it's in its 6th year, and we are foreseeing 2 more austerity budgets up to 2015. One of the main consequences of this is to hit domestic demand, and that of course then is seen as one of the reasons why economic growth remains very low. There's also the reduction and the weakening of public services. It's interesting that in the last Troika report on the Irish case, that one of the new elements introduced is that the Irish state now has to make a monthly report to the Troika on how it's cutting health spending, because the Troika isn't satisfied that health spending has been sufficiently cut so far. Now, that's what's happening within the domestic economy. The one result of that is that international markets seem very pleased, and Ireland has been dipping its toe in international financial markets since the end of last year very successfully, and it's been able to raise more finance than it expected to be able to do at lower interest rates than it expected, and so therefore the state is pretty confident that it's going to be able to exit its bailout program by the end of 2013, which is what was expected. However, a report last week from the IMF has warned that by no means is Ireland out of the crisis, and that there are many, many danger signals along the way, and indeed the IMF is arguing that, for example, the ERM, the European Stability Mechanism, should take up some of the burden of readjustment of the Irish banking sector, which it has done in the case of Spain, but so far has refused to do in the case of Ireland. Now, the impacts then I want to deal with under 3 headings: the banking sector, the wider economy, and then the wider society. The Irish banking sector has not in any way been brought back to profitability. We had 6 domestic banks. All of those banks remain dependent upon state support. The Bank of Ireland, which is the largest bank, is the only bank that in some ways is showing some signs of being able to return to the market and to exit support from the state. All the other banks are virtually entirely dependent on the state. Most of them have been entirely nationalised. The 2 worst cases, which have now been closed down, but it took the Irish state until earlier this year to finally close them down, so there's been a long lag in dealing with this on the part of the state. And the IMF remains very critical. In its report of last week, it pointed out that the Irish banks have a rising number of non-performing loans, and it argues that a sharp improvement is needed in this area. It's basically saying that the Irish banks aren't facing up to the extent of the crisis. This is something that has been debated very much domestically, but we still remain to see sufficient action on the part of the banks to put that problem on a more solid foundation. The IMF is saying that the low level of bank lending is a significant obstacle to recovery. There's been a running debate within the domestic press about the extent to which banks are reluctant to lend to people to buy property, so the property market remains severely depressed. And secondly, that small businesses in particular are finding it very hard to survive because they're finding it very hard to get credit from the banking sector. And the IMF explicitly expressed concern at both the viability and the profitability of the banking sector. Both of those terms I take from the latest IMF report, and it seeks what it called a durable restructuring of the sector. Now, it seems to me that speaking to an Icelandic audience, it must be remarkable that 6 years after the crisis hitting us in September 2008, that we still have a banking sector that hasn't been sufficiently reformed and is still virtually entirely dependent on the state for its survival. And the final issue to draw your attention to, and it seems to me to be socially a very significant issue, that there's a lot of public anger at the fact that we continue to have evidence that bank CEOs, and indeed retired CEOs who were responsible for landing us in the crisis, still manage to have very high salaries and very high pensions, and even though the banking sector is effectively owned by the state, that the state can do very little about this. You know, multiples of the salaries of our president and our prime minister are being earned by the CEOs of our nationalised banks. It seems a bizarre situation, and this fuels a lot of public anger. So that's the impact on the banking system. On the wider economy, I think we have to say that we have an economy that's virtually in stagnation. It's bouncing along the bottom. There are no signs of any significant growth in the economy. The IMF is critical of the government's failure to deliver on employment activation measures, and it was heavily noted in the last IMF report that they estimated for the first time a figure for underemployment. Our unemployment rate has been hovering at about 14.5% for the last 3 years. It's not going up, but it's not going down. However, what the IMF focused in on was this rate of 23% of what they called underemployment. In other words, sections of the labour force who would want to be fully employed but can't be fully employed because of the extent of decline in the economy. They used the adjective staggering, that this was a staggering figure. And as Irish journalists pointed out, for the IMF to use an adjective like staggering is itself quite remarkable. So they're drawing attention to this as a very serious problem, and they are finding fault with the government for not doing more to address that. Now, in the context of continuing austerity, the government's latest plan has been to reduce its public sector wage bill by €1 billion. Now, this is the second time that the government has gone to the public sector unions to negotiate a deal, which is downsizing the public sector, cutting public sector salaries, and making their conditions of employment more flexible. The first was called the Croke Park deal because it was negotiated in Croke Park, the headquarters of the Gaelic Athletic Association. And the public sector unions, who bit the bullet and agreed to that deal 3 years ago, 2010 if I remember rightly, thought that this was it, that they were pledged then until the end of the austerity programme that the government wouldn't come back to them. And they've been very angry that the government has gone back to them and effectively delivered an ultimatum that they want a Croke Park 2 deal, which again delivers more savings of €1 billion, which means further cutbacks to public sector salaries and to those of us former employees of the public sector who are on pensions. My pension is going to be cut back over as part of this deal, for example. But what it is doing is leading to an outburst of anger from the public sector unions, very unlike their willingness up to now to go along with the austerity package. And quite a few unions are recommending to their members to reject this deal, but even more significantly, up to now the norm has been that across the range of public sector unions, even if some unions reject a deal, that they take the deal in the aggregate. So even if some unions reject it, if the total number of trade unionists vote in favour, I mean if a majority vote in favour, then it will be accepted by all the unions, even those who have rejected it. And in the last few days, a number of public sector unions have said they're now breaking that arrangement. And so therefore, if their members reject it, then they are not going to go ahead with this deal. So we do, for the first time, have a looming clash between public sector unions and the government. And it'll be very interesting to see what emerges. It does look like this will be quite severely defeated by union members. Now, the government says that if it's rejected, they are going to impose cutbacks anyway, but they're going to impose them on frontline services. So one way or the other, we're in for a very difficult period over this. And as I've said already, the IMF are continuing to say that the prospects for the economic recovery in the medium term are very uncertain. I give you there the GDP growth for 2012, 0.9%. That's the best we've had since 2007, but it's very low. Estimates for 2013 are 1.2%. And we must remember that all government projections to meet debt GDP ratios, for example, are premised upon higher levels of growth. Year after year after year, the government has had to revise downwards its growth estimates. And so therefore we're now running at a GDP debt ratio of about 123%, which is about the limits of what's seen as being viable. all projections of how we can reduce that are dependent upon higher levels of GDP growth than are very likely to materialise. So we are in a very vulnerable position, despite the fact that international markets are expressing confidence in us. Now, the final dimension is the impact on society, and I think this often gets written out of the picture, but this ultimately is the most important dimension to look at. We have, as one would expect, an increase in poverty. Poverty at the end of our boom period was beginning finally to decline. The latest figures come from 2011, quite a major increase in the 2 years up to 2011, and we all expect that more recent figures will show a continuing increase. High levels of emigration have again become the norm in Ireland. I mean, you don't meet a family, including my own family, who have seen people emigrating. My own eldest daughter, when she graduated from university last June, immediately emigrated. She's now living in London. And the latest estimates that we have had 90,000 people, most of them young people, emigrating over the last 2 years. This would equate to something close to a little under 5% of the labour force. So if the IMF is talking about a staggering underemployment rate of 23%, one needs to add a further 5% to that to begin to realise the real effects of un- and underemployment, particularly on younger people. Inevitably, cutbacks are hitting the poorest and the most vulnerable most. It's a bit of an embarrassment for the Labour Party in government that independent commentators are pointing to the fact that the last two austerity budgets have hit the lower paid worse than the higher paid, because of course Labour's claim to be in government is that it's going to protect the poorest and the most vulnerable. That isn't happening. There's a very significant issue of generational injustice emerging, and namely that unemployment is hitting younger people far more than it's hitting older people. There's something inevitable about that, I suppose. And also, of course, the burden of people having taken out mortgages at the height of the boom for properties that are now worth only 50% of what they were when people bought them is again affecting younger people rather than people my age group. Though on the news this morning, the Irish news, it is interesting that there's a new report just came out yesterday that surprised many people by saying that there is also a very significant problem among people in their 40s, 50s and 60s of repaying mortgages, partly because there was this advice during the boom years that you remortgage your homes in order probably to buy a foreign property in Spain or whatever. A lot of people did that, and so therefore these people are now finding their repayments very difficult to meet. There's a very high rate of suicide among young males. I think we have the highest rate now within the whole of the EU. This is an issue of great concern within Irish society. And last week there was a lot of media coverage at the time of the annual conventions of the teachers unions about problems that teachers are now voicing that they're finding in the classroom. And the thing that struck me very forcefully were the high levels of depression that they're finding. That students are showing signs of very high levels of depression, of any lack of any hope for the future, a complete lack of hope for the future. That I find very worrying, because you're condemning a whole generation to really a sense of despair about what they can hope for in the future. Now, the final point to make is, and we often comment on it in Ireland, those of us who work on issues, academics who work on issues of social protest, social movements, etc., is the sort of almost the virtual passivity of most sectors of the Irish population. There's widespread anger which gets voiced rhetorically all the time, and yet the amount of protest against cutbacks has been very, very limited and very sporadic and never very lasting. And sometimes we compare that with the protest that you had outside your parliament that led to the fall of the government in 2009 and the replacement of the government here, which from observing it from abroad seemed to be a very positive thing. So I want to emphasise, if Ireland is the success case of the Eurozone, then it underlines just how severe are the other countries in crisis. Now, Toti knows more about this than I do, but the Greek case seems to be a case where at least there's a decade of the most severe recession facing the country, and as a political scientist, the dimension of the Greek case that most alarms me is the rise of this neo-Nazi party, which seems to be one of the effects of this crisis throughout Europe. and I'll come to other dimensions of that in a moment, but that's how it manifests itself in Greece as far as I can see. In Portugal, we've had this latest decision by the Constitutional Court that has struck down some of the key dimensions of the government's austerity package, and that now throws the issue back to the government as to how they're going to implement austerity. It's interesting that this is impacting on Ireland's hope to get an extension of the date of maturity for its repayment of its loans and its bailout package, and this is being decided today in Dublin Castle by the European finance ministers who are meeting in their two-day Ecofin meeting, because Ireland and Portugal have applied jointly to have an extension of 7 years for the repayment of their loans. Then some of the foreign ministers going into the meeting interviewed this morning were concerned that because of this crisis in Lisbon, due to the decision of the Constitutional Court, that this decision may not now go through today's Ecofin meeting, and that of course will disappoint Ireland very much, because this is one feature that it was hoping to get from this meeting. Then on Cyprus, I take a quote here from a professor of political economy in the University of Nicosia, Theo Tafanis, a man I've met actually, who described it, the bailout package, as an attack on Cyprus that takes the country back decades. I'm struck by the little bit of reading I've done on the Cypriot crisis, just how angry academic commentators are with the severity of the package, and they argue that this wasn't at all needed, that the Cypriot authorities were beginning to deal with the problem, and that there were far more benign pathways out of the crisis than are being now implemented through the bailout package. The imposition of capital controls on a currency that is a common currency of 17 countries is, to me, it seems absolutely remarkable, and it weakens the euro immensely. It seems to me virtually a contradiction that you can have capital controls within a common currency zone within one of those countries. And what are being predicted are dramatic falls in GDP and increases in unemployment. I have seen Cypriot economists estimating falls in GDP of between 10 and 20% as a result of this bailout package, which strains credibility, it seems to me. And for those of us who are, in Ireland, seen as being model reformers, it's the contagion effects of these crises that are worrying. As soon as the Cypriot crisis hit, the Irish media continued to debate, is this going to affect us? Is it going to affect, for example, market confidence in the Irish case? And this is a factor, I think, in the overall Eurozone crisis that one needs to take into account. That a country can't, if you like, seek a path of recovery on its own. It's inevitably affected by how other countries in crisis in the Eurozone are doing. As a political scientist, I'm most concerned by the political impacts, and I think we may underestimate these at our cost. Because it's not only the rise of neo-right parties in a country like Greece. Ultimately, it is the failure of our democratic institutions to show routes forward out of the crisis that offer an alternative to the austerity packages that are being imposed. Many people on the left and in the trade union sector are arguing for stimulus packages, but our political systems don't seem to be able to provide results that will allow for alternatives to austerity to have a real effect. So we have, I think, two common tendencies that you can see across the Eurozone, across the European Union and beyond. You see them here as well, as far as I can see. One is volatility, that polls are showing that people are deserting their traditional affiliations, but they're not replacing those with any permanent and stable affiliations to new parties. So they're moving around. So there's a lot of, in opinion polls in Ireland, as I understand it here also in Iceland and elsewhere in Europe, what one sees are parties moving up and down very suddenly in opinion polls. This is striking. And a certain number of traditional parties, which have been firm anchors of their country's political systems, declining dramatically. PASOK in Greece, the Socialist Party in Spain. I spent the 2 months up to Christmas in Spain, and it was striking. There were 3 regional elections during that time, that the party that suffered most in those elections, in Galicia, in Catalonia, and in the Basque Country, were the Socialists, not the People's Party in power in Madrid. And the Socialist Party is in very severe crisis in Spain. partly because, of course, it's tarred with the brush of having been the party that began to introduce austerity. And our own Fianna Fáil, the hegemonic party of Irish politics since 1932, has suffered a catastrophic collapse. It's beginning to show an increase in the polls, but there's no signs that it's going to in any way return to the position that it used to have. So the electorate is unsure of who to support in this situation. And then you see the fragmentation. You see it clearly in this election here in Iceland, where you have a large number of new parties emerging. This fragmentation is also evident in Ireland, for example, where we see a lot of a huge support for independence. About 25% of the opinion poll support is now for independents, individuals, which is a very big percentage. Another 25% of people in Ireland saying they're undecided who they'd vote for. So 50% of the electorate are not plumping for any party, which itself is significant, and a very significant fragmentation of the electoral system. If that was to work through in a general election, then it would lead to a situation of virtual ungovernability, it seems to me. You have the right-wing party in Greece, I've mentioned twice, I think, Grillo's five-star movement in Italy, which again is paralysing the ability to be able to form a government. So that fragmentation is leading to a whole new situation for our political systems. It's a very grave situation, it seems to me. It's undermining the credibility of democracy itself and our democratic institutions. That seems to be a common feature of this crisis throughout Europe. And it's weakening, as I've said, the possibility of finding a new way forward to emerge from this. So it does seem to me that we have a very serious pan-European crisis on our hands, and that the European project itself is in severe crisis. I mean, when one sees the level of anger being voiced, most recently on the streets in Cyprus, but we also see it in Ireland, a level of anger against Europe, against European institutions, European decision makers. This is new. I never remember this in my lifetime. Ireland has been a member of the European Union since 1973. We've always had high levels of support for European membership. This is being very fast eroded by these crises. And that has long-term implications. Again, I think we're not attending sufficiently to that. The fact that we see the rules being written and rewritten, and there was big commentary in Ireland that when we went for our bailout package, the government wanted to, it was part of the negotiations, that the government wanted to more burden sharing by Europe, and Europe refused that. And then we see in the Cypriot package, for example, that bondholders are being hit in a way that what we weren't allowed. Thank you very much. We weren't allowed to do. We now have this decision about the ESM mechanism, the European Stability Mechanism. The Irish government has been arguing that it should be allowed to support the Irish banks and so therefore to take the pressure off the Irish state. This was allowed for Spain. And different noises have been made by senior European politicians as to whether this will be allowed for Ireland or not. But there's no decision been made, and the latest view is that it will be another year before a decision might be made. So this is, again, hampering Ireland's recovery. The latest decision today at the ECOFIN meeting in Dublin is another example of this. A decision that Ireland thought was very likely to get, it may not now get because of the crisis in Portugal. The euro itself is in crisis, as confidence in it as a single currency is waning. And it seems to me the Cypriot crisis and the decisions that were made and then retracted and then remade has itself further undermined the euro. And as I say, the public anger at the European Union is growing. And amid all this, what is striking is that there are no clear perspectives emerging about how we get out of this crisis. We lurch from crisis to crisis, with no clear vision of a future. And as the Greek professor Theonophanos put it, there's a lack of vision and a comprehensive economic strategy to get out of this negative, vicious circle. That's certainly how it's seen in Ireland. And what we see is that we're being held hostage, particularly by German domestic politics. It is not known whether, if a decision is made about using the ESM, the stability mechanism, to support Irish banks, that the Bundestag will have to vote on that. And of course the Bundestag, as Angela Merkel is finding, is becoming ever more hostile towards some of these efforts to try to aid Eurozone countries. Indeed, if a decision is made today to extend the maturities on the Irish and the Portuguese loans, it's also unsure whether the Bundestag will have to agree to that before Germany might approve it. So there is this sense that we're held hostage to the domestic politics of a certain number of Eurozone countries. So my conclusion is that at the moment austerity is the only approach, and that the arguments of parties on the left, of the trade union movement, I mean the trade union movement in Ireland has been consistently arguing since the beginning that we need a stimulus package. These have fallen on deaf ears. They've had no influence on policy that I can see. Ireland, as I say, is being seen as the only one success case, but it's a success case for international market confidence. It's not a success case for the performance of the Irish economy, and much less for Irish society, where people are at the end of their tether right now in terms of being able to take more austerity. I was talking last week about the commentary at the teachers' unions, and I was absolutely shocked when I heard one teacher from a school very close to where I live, which is seen as one of the most prosperous areas in the whole of the country, saying that she has children coming to school in the morning hungry. Now, if that's the case in one of the most prosperous areas in Dublin, what is it like in poorer areas? These are dramatic. This is a dramatic social crisis that we mustn't underestimate. So we have, it seems to me, and I don't think that this is exaggerating it, we have a real tension between democracy and markets. And the paradox of the present moment, it's not lost on many people, is that a crisis, which for many of us is a crisis of market exuberance and the failure of states to regulate markets, is being responded to by giving more power to those markets. And all the decisions that are made by our public authorities seem always premised upon the fact, will we regain the confidence of markets? So I was asked, when I was asked to give this talk, to comment upon how Iceland is doing. I don't dare do that, but having been briefed by a number of people, including Professor here, the two things strike me. Number one is that it seems to me that you have recovered better than any Eurozone country is likely to recover, and yet the electorate seems to be very willing to punish the party that led you through that recovery. And the second thing is that your politics are manifesting these same criteria, these same conditions of volatility and fragmentation that we're seeing throughout the European Union. So I'm interested to see how this story appears from an Icelandic perspective. Thank you.